Well, I think there are a number of things to unpick here. First of all, Greenland has always been there. We've had a Cold War since the end of the Second World War until about 20 years ago, and Greenland was no great significant part of that conflict. It is true that Greenland is a massive landmass, massive island, biggest island in the world, and it sits betwixt the US and Russia. But of course, it sits right next door to Canada, which is a massive country in itself. It is inhabited, I think, by less than 100,000 people, which for such a vast country makes it one of the least populated places on Earth. It's pretty hospitable. It's winter most of the time. It has a few sort of strategic uses. The Americans have a base there. No doubt the Canadians use it for training. But of course, the other element to it, it is part of Denmark. It's an element to that. Denmark is a NATO country. The US is a NATO country. The idea of two NATO countries fighting together is completely incongruous. One just cannot see it happening. Of course, this is, for the US to take it would be old-fashioned colonization. The Americans bought Alaska off the Russians, many years ago. And it would appear the American interest is not about security. That's a sideline. That's to deflect. It's about deals. It's about raw materials. It's thought that Greenland has some of the largest supplies of rare earth minerals and also oil and gas. And that seems to be the thing that is really piquing Trump interest and the other businessmen that he now has running the United States. So not about security. So a very strange move. Of course, perhaps deflecting what the real business the Americans should be doing at the moment is trying to get a ceasefire and prevent the war in Ukraine developing into a European and possibly a world war. It's exactly what Putin would do. Putin, as we've discussed before, is trying to recreate the old Soviet Union, the Greater Russia, which is why he's trying to expand into Ukraine. And also, he has told us very clearly that he wants all those old Soviet states, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, back under Russian control. So, for him, if Trump wants to take a country next to the United States, then that's probably perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, I think, President Trump and President Putin are not that different in outlook. They might be different in execution, thank God, because, although people are talking about potential US forces taking Greenland, I think that just cannot happen because of the Article 5 situation, where if one NATO country is invaded or attacked, then all NATO countries are involved, and that would completely destroy any sort of idea that Trump has of taking Greenland. But of course, Putin is delighted because we were supposed to have a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine a few weeks ago. Earlier this week, there was talking about a Black Sea ceasefire, which Putin is very happy to sign, and Trump's negotiators seem to be ebullient about it. But even before the ink is dry, Putin changes the situation. Today, he is suggesting that Ukraine should be run by the United Nations. Absolutely ridiculous. So anything that is taking the worldview off Ukraine, as far as Putin is concerned, is great, because he is cracking on. He believes he's winning in Ukraine. They're making advances. They're attacking all the time. But having said that, Ukraine is also really hurting the Russians too. We heard of the big attack on a base, destroying 96 cruise missiles. That is a lot of rubles of cruise missiles. 4 big helicopters were destroyed this week as well. So it's not all one-way traffic. And anything that Putin can do to deflect off Ukraine, and to make sure that Trump and his advisors are trying to do business deals rather than to create a ceasefire that would be unhelpful to Putin at the moment, then he is supporting, and that's exactly what he's saying. And he's even quoted as saying what a good job Trump is doing. So, and the final bit on this, those of us who are very much supporting Ukraine and seeing how things unfold are as exasperated as President Zelensky and the Ukraine people are that Trump seems to be more in Putin's pocket than he is as an honest broker trying to prevent the war spreading in Europe. So, yeah, if I was Putin, I'd be sitting very happily in the Kremlin at the moment. It's all going exactly my way, and I'm being helped by the new administration in the White House. I'm not very experienced about fighting in the Arctic or fighting cold weather fighting, as it's called. My main experience is in the desert, but the environments are very similar. So I'm led to believe the desert is obviously very, very hot, and somewhere like Greenland and the Arctic is very, very cold. But you need real specialist troops to do this. And Britain has its Royal Marines, and they train frequently in Norway to protect the sort of northern flank with the Norwegian military. But they are fairly small. So fighting in somewhere like Greenland would be hugely challenging. But we've seen how warfare has developed in Ukraine, and the challenge with Greenland for anybody fighting there is the remoteness of it. Not having the logistics, getting them there. Simple things like power. You need power to generate drones and intelligence and the wherewithal. It strikes me also it's a literal, in other words, a lot of the fighting will be around the coast. So navy and seafaring, it would be very important. But having said that, also it's a fairly uncomplex landscape. And what I mean by there, there are not many trees. So surveillance and everything else is rather more straightforward, and it's fairly open. However, Greenland is a vast place. It's very, very mountainous. You need specialist vehicles, specialist track vehicles, to be able to move around the place. And you'd need a lot of air power, a lot of helicopters. And again, it goes back to logistics. I don't know how long it would take a helicopter to fly from north to south, but it's hours and hours and hours. So, the considerations. The key thing is, fighting in that environment is incredibly demanding and requires the most highly trained soldiers to be effective. America will have a few, we have a few, the Russians no doubt would have a few, but it's not something that either, the Russians or the Americans have an awful lot of. It's always, I think, been thought that this is not a place people would fight, which, if you go back to some of the great military philosophers like Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, of course, they would say because of that, it's probably an area that you should consider fighting in because you would have an advantage. Bottom line is incredibly challenging and incredibly difficult. And I wouldn't have thought anybody would want to go there unless it's absolutely essential. What appears to be the thing that is really interesting the White House now is the vast supply of rare earth minerals, oil and gas. And it would appear that President Trump is driven by the ability to do deals that make money for himself and America than anything else. I think from a conservation perspective, I am sure the Greens and everybody else are absolutely, throwing their hands in the air. The ability, the possibility that this one of the few untouched places of the earth, President Trump and no doubt President Putin want to put their bulldozers over and flatten and get as much stuff out as they can to enrich themselves. So that now seems to be the issue. From a strategic perspective, it is not figured in the last sort of 100 years as somewhere where, the great powers that oppose each other want to fight over. It would appear now that that mining and extraction, but no doubt because of technological advances, is now possible. That it's now becoming interesting. So that's where we are. I think it it's another deal for the businessman in Washington to make, and that's why it's so horrific. And the fact that it's deflecting so much information and activity from people who should be trying to secure a peace in Europe and the Middle East. I'm sure when Mrs. Vance started off on her plan to visit Greenland, it all seemed absolutely sensible and the sort of thing you would expect the Second Lady of the US to do, to go and visit cultural events in Greenland. However, now it's sort of been hijacked as a business deal. I understand from reading various media in this country that the Greenlanders have very much said they don't want to see them, and American pollsters or American people have been knocking on every door in Greenland asking if they would like to meet the vice president and his wife, and virtually everybody said no. So again, it's unfortunate. It seems to be the way that politics is done, particularly in the US at the moment. Spin, counter spin, and the people who are really in the middle of this, who are being ignored, are the Greenlanders, and that is pretty sad. So hopefully now the visit has been very much downscaled. I understand Vance and his wife are just going to visit the space base in the north of the country, and that will be it. And they won't be imposing on the Greenlanders, who, I assume just want to get on with life as it was and continue in that vein going forward.